Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day two of Urban Arc. This is our first session today. We have six very exciting papers. We will finish all the papers at a stretch and then take Q&A right at the end to make sure that everybody gets enough time. So please do send in your questions on the chat box or on the Q&A box. And we'll put them together at the end of the session. We'll begin today with Shrishti Mandal, who is at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. Her presentation is titled Infrastructure of Romance, Premarital Relationship in Urban Spaces in Contemporary India. Shrishti, you can get started. You have 15 minutes.
Yes, I'll just share my screen. Is it visible? Okay, so can I start? Yeah, okay. So good morning, everyone. The title of my paper is Infrastructure of Romance, Premarital Relationship in Urban Spaces in Contemporary India. So the term infrastructure of romance has been borrowed from Era Wilson's pioneering work, The Intimate Economies of Bangkok, where she explores how retail revolution and the subsequent growth of shopping malls have provided spaces for leisure. It not only it not only enables newer patterns of consumption but also encourages the expression of diverse sexual identities. Thus, the retail revolution substantiates how expanding capitalist markets are affecting and in turn are affected by the intimate lives of people. Urban imaginations proved to be pivotal to the transformation of cities. This was significant in envisioning a modern city unfettered by tradition. In contemporary matrimonial matchmaking, the modes of intermediation are contingent on an array of contextually embedded interdependent factors. In this regard, the idea of space as quasi public seems paramount. Premarital relationships occur in spaces that are away from the home, mostly in leisure spaces that are removed from the immediate surveillance of the respective families. These leisure spaces have been fostered by the transforming urban landscape that often has its foundation in economic liberalization that enables the urban youth to meet in less regulated ways. However, we need to distinguish between the physical surveillance of families and surveillance via specific moralities that is specific to diverse families. This could be substantiated by the differential attitude towards visiting pubs or meeting in family restaurants. Thus, spaces assume the role of a mirror, reflecting the moralities that make up the habitats of specific individuals. The socio-spatial dynamics of urban areas reflect new forms of social intermingling, practices, as well as changing ideas of marriage, romance, and sex. These individuals are aware that their premarital relationships may not materialize into marriage, but romantic encounters in these socially less regulated urban spaces of leisure, like shopping malls, bars, clubs, restaurants, and so on, provide spaces of freedom, independence, and confidence to individuals with disposable income. Thus, these spaces host myriad expressions of identity which might otherwise remain unnoticed. Thus, space has become conducive in the making of modern middle class identities where one can choose to write their own biographies. New urban spaces are nodes of economic development. Christian Rosius went further to assert that urban spaces of leisure, like shopping malls, are an indicator of both economic prosperity as well as conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption characterizes the performativity of the new middle class identity and a marker of public self affirmation. Moreover, these cultures of leisure and spaces away from home become markers of neoliberal identity since the transformation to open market economy from planned economy also indicates a shift towards consumption as indicator of progress. So marital practices that involve premarital intimacy and courtship is increasingly becoming conspicuous in India. It is more and more about creating a positive self via one's consumption patterns. With specific reference to Valentine's Day celebration, Christian Brosius explains that premarital love might not be intended to evolve into marriage, but it depicts the public display of affection via transforming urban structures, especially spaces of urban leisure. Moreover, this study also draws special attention to matrimonial processes during the recent COVID-19 pandemic situation, whereby the idea of physical space has been replaced to a large extent by digital platforms due to challenges posed to face-to-face interaction. During these online interactions, the architecture of the physical background speaks of the taste of the persons concerned. In these few months of the pandemic, the idea of urban imageries has altered to envision the urban in a way that physically distances individuals and communities, but also socially brings them to proximity. The expanding capitalist infrastructures affect the infrastructure of interpersonal relationship in ways that provokes me to assert the personal is commercial. In this regard, the relationship between urban spaces and wedding as conspicuous consumption is an important arena which requires critical inquiry. The idea of aspirational weddings and weddings as a means to create a spectacle highlights how big industries have been capitalizing on Indian customs and traditions. As Doreen Massey argues, the idea of space needs to be rooted in concepts or practices like relationality, heterogeneity, and coevalence. The space is a contingent phenomena or process that is always in the making. For instance, the choice of cuisine, restaurants, shopping malls, or any meeting place defines not only the taste, cultural capital, or economic capital of the person concerned, but it also engages respective parties into a complex compatibility. Many a times, relationships face tension when compatibility is solely based on these external criteria that is assumed to represent one's class. Thus, urban spaces define forms of sociability since the conception of space is rooted in human perception. As Ingold suggests, that the environment is something which is not external to us, rather, it is a zone of entanglement. Moreover, the diffusion of global standards ensures that the local is constituted, entangled, or interwoven with the global. Thus, an analysis of these urban imageries of the future could explicate the multiple hierarchies which structures our everyday lives. This provides a good starting point to explore the interactions between the reconfigured urban landscape, forms of sociality, and the dynamic expression of individual identities. These spaces could be reimagined through the politics of acoustics as well as olfaction, which creates new spaces of urban inclusion and socio-spatial fragmentation. As scholars have suggested, urban imaginaries meaningfully interweave different elements of the urban social landscape, thus playing an important role in the reconfiguration of socio-spatial politics of urban spaces. These link together the class politics, geopolitics, gender politics, ecopolitics, and the like. However, one must be significantly aware of the routinized cultural complexity and specificity of the affective relationships between urban spaces and their consumer base because these are the consumers who have divergent biographies. So with this, I would like to say that while scholars have focused much on how cities have brought together an array of spatial practices from labor and employment, literature, and architecture and planning to environmental sustainability, economic growth, culture, and politics, in this paper, I have intended to trace the impact of these changes on the affective dimension of interpersonal relationship during matrimonial matchmaking. Thank you.
Thank you for that really interesting presentation. We'll just quickly move to the next presentation by Anant Kamath, who's at the National Institute for Advanced Studies. Anant, over to you.
Just a moment.
While you're setting up, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box or on the Q&A box. We'll collect all of them and have a discussion at the end.
Are we ready?
Yeah, you can start.
Okay. All right, fine. So thank you for the invitation to present at Urban Arc. I'm with the Inequality and Human Development Program at the National Institute for Advanced Studies, NIAS. And I present also on behalf of my co-author, Neeti, who is with the IIHS, working on issues of labor and urban employment. This is part of a broader project on street-based sex work in urban transition in Bangalore, which has been funded by Azim Premji University during our time there in 2018. Now, street-based sex workers in the city as an informal workforce have been systematically losing their spaces of life and livelihood due to a neoliberal urban transition in Bangalore, which has aggravated their vulnerability and dispossession, denying even the existence of a narrative of urban transition experience from their viewpoint. An entire ecology around street-based sex work has disintegrated, pushing many workers into further invisibility and gradually melting away their grasp on their city. For the last 3 decades, the meaning of public space has undergone a dramatic change along the very definition of who ought to constitute the public in this city. Dominant urban imaginaries, defined by city master plans, deny the very existence of alternative spatial cartographies and human landscapes in the city. That's why it's critically important to reveal the experiences of street-based sex workers, drawing out sexual counter-geographies of Bangalore, since the dominant urban imaginaries deny the very existence of these cartographies. So our study here has 2 objectives. First of all, to construct those sexual landscapes in the city as defined by female, male, and transgender street-based sex workers, and to construct the menagerie of actors who constitute their human landscape. The second objective is to bring out the ordeals of Bangalore's transition through the textured narratives of these workers, laying out in full view the urban sexscape of Bangalore, like Bangalore's many other landscapes. So this study reinforces sex work as a theme in Indian urban studies and urban space and urban transition as a theme in Indian sex work scholarship, both one to another. So we wish to reinforce street-based sex work as an urban concern. Neoliberal urbanism has ensured a disconnected urban experience for many swaths of people, where city spaces have become a corporate landscape of leisure and playgrounds of consumerism catering to the affluent. As part of gentrification and revanchism, urban space is purified, decontaminated, reclaimed, and made respectable, formulating on who the ideal public ought to be. In the city's human ecology, the grotesque, those with revolting amorous preferences, and immoral contaminants of decent city spaces are pathological to the vision and spirit of the city's human ecology, and the city spaces are cordoned off for them. To these people, however, such as sex workers, these scintillating metropolitan visions are meaningless, and borrowing from Vakwan, modernity to them has been nothing but the modernization of their misery. Sex work in Bangalore was generously scattered across urban spaces and it occupied mainstream structures for decades, where sexual identities and sexual commerce were inscribed on the cityscape as much as on their body. In this study, we adopted the oral histories method, which congregates stories, statements, and reminiscences from individuals and groups who relate these as first-hand narrations of what they think is important. That is, we took the narratives of what the sex workers themselves thought was important in Bangalore's urban transition, rather than us looking at it from our point of view. So we assembled, aggregated, collated, and reconstructed their recollections and their personal commentaries about experiences, people, about artifact spaces, and many other entities in their cartography. We restricted to economically low-end sex workers who solicit an open urban space, and in the institutional setting of the street economy, overwhelmingly they hail from the Dalit castes or other lower castes. And finally, we collected narratives from 5 dozen male, female, and transgender sex workers in Bangalore city who have spent from 20 to 40 years in the field. We spent 18 months visiting and revisiting them with the invaluable support of a research assistant. We located our narrators through organizations such as the Alternative Law Forum, through Aneka, Solidarity Foundation, Payana, Sadhana Mahila Sangha, the National Network of Sex Workers, the Karnataka Sex Worker Unions, and many other organizations which we cannot name here. We also gained insights from Reach Law, from the People's Union for Civil Liberties, and above all, Sangama, the organization, stood as our principal guide, logistically, motivationally, and intellectually. We chose 3 locations in Bangalore: KR Market, Majestic, and the MG Road area, which are geographically and historically focal for street-based sex work. In KR Market, workers are older, they're more desperate, but the area is least hostile to them, especially towards transgender sex workers. Customers here are also much poorer, much more rural, and much more lower working class. In the Majestic area, workers and customers are of a slightly higher income bracket, very slightly higher, mostly local, mostly urban, mostly middle range, while the MG Road area offers clients and customers ranging from salaried middle class right up to the affluent. The sheer sweep of ancillary actors orbiting street-based sex workers for decades prior to Bangalore's grand urban transition was staggering. These people include people like lodge managers, lodge staff, auto rickshaw drivers, bus conductors, bus drivers, street vendors, small shops, public toilet watchmen, park watchmen, cinemas, theater stars, security guards, staff of restaurants and eateries, health workers, social workers, of course the police. All these were the galaxy of people who were the ancillaries and the adversaries around street-based sex work in Bangalore. Even as far as places go, there was so much in their cartography. The lodge room, for instance, was the principal site of service after soliciting customers on the street. So bellboys, lodge managers, cleaning staff in those lodges were important people to build social capital in for these sex workers. Transgender sex workers particularly had a good relationship with street vendors and shopkeepers because they needed they needed protection to even appear in a particular area. So these agents, such as vendors, regularly provided for rest, for recuperation, to hide from violent customers, to hide from the police, and sometimes even acting as brokers to bring in customers. Auto rickshaw drivers also ferried customers from sex work from a railway station and elsewhere, and provided a space for relaxation also. Auto drivers and lodge staff used to work hand in glove with the customers being dropped off precisely at those lodges where managers can bring workers. Cinema theaters were a very long favorite of especially female sex workers. Hence, those manning the doors of the halls, those in the box offices, the theater managers, the cleaners, all of them were to be invested in by these sex workers as social capital. They were all aware of these activities going on in the odd time shows of these theaters, but they were all tolerated because they did not affect anything. Parks have been a great haunt for transgender sex workers, right from the Mammoth Carbon Park right down to local neighborhood parks. Because parks provided, in their words, the best of many worlds. One could remain there for hours on end without the guard noticing or without anything being noticed. Rarely did park watchmen report to the police, and also shopping centers were pretty important for these sex workers to do solicitation and operation. Spaces around religious sites, both Hindu and Muslim religious sites in the Majestic and KR Market area, were important spots for sex work where people groves welcomed not only solicitation but even recuperation. Large trees had a special place in street-based sex work in Bangalore as principal areas of solicitation, socialization, refuge from the police, even spots to offer services after dark. Bangalore was full of such large trees with sweeping canopies in public buildings, in older neighborhoods, with huge bamboo and eucalyptus groves in the barren outskirts. Even Parthenium thickets were work sites for sex work in the city. Lakes also were important, which had laundry and minor fishing going on in the mornings and sex work going on around them for the rest of the day and night. For male sex workers, public toilets were very important. Public toilets were everywhere at all major public spaces in marketplaces and neighborhoods. Bus stands and vegetable markets supplied a torrent of customers from the city and outside. They provided quite a lot of freedom for these sex workers to just be there. And a lot of intricate social capital was woven in these bus terminuses. In fact, women and transgender workers also benefited from trucks parked in vegetable and fruit markets like Alasipalayam or Yeshwantpur. And finally, of course, as I said earlier, shopping complexes in Majestic and Janata Bazaar and so on were also hotspots. This was what the urban landscape and the whole collection of people around sex work used to be in Bangalore. But the entire industry has faced upheaval over the last 20 years. The galaxy of people and the tapestry of places which we just talked about now crumbled over a long 20-year period in the process of creating a Bangalore, a special type of Bangalore. An entire ecology around street-based sex work in this area aggressively disintegrated, pushing many of these workers into either further invisibility and melting away their grasp on their city. Younger workers whom we spoke to had none of these very beautiful tapestries of urban space, and they talked about the city not as an open urban space for doing sex work, but more as a trapeze act, where one had to leap and swing from one disappearing patch to another, practically playing hide and seek from all these people. So the younger workers did not have any of these experiences that we had talked about. crusades against the misuse of public space by sex work has enjoyed the full support of middle and upper middle classes, backed by the corporate sector, who wish to rehabilitate the city's image as some sort of a peaceful, air-conditioned and content city, engrossed with their own upmarket concern about image, aesthetics, planning, environment, and so on. So the sex landscape of Bangalore experienced tumultuous transformation under the crushing weight of the neoliberal gentrification that rumbled above it. Over 2 decades, the trees, the groves, and the lakes we talked about disappeared. The Parthenium tracks disappeared. Theaters and complexes began disintegrating. CCTV cameras were installed everywhere. Street vendors and small shops began giving cold shoulders to them. Public toilet staff stopped, reduced in their cooperation. So did auto drivers and bus staff. Watchmen turned into much more professional security guards who did not allow sex work. Parks suddenly started having gates and barricades, and lodges acquired a veneer of morality, where even shopping centers became plazas, theaters became multiplexes, bare grounds became metro stations, and lodges became deluxe lodges, which did not allow this sort of thing. Groves disappeared in and around the city, converted into gated parks. There were also many Save the Lake campaigns, where lakes were now meant to be only for recreational, religious, or artistic purposes among the affluent, not for sex workers. So the corroding array of ecological commons affected especially transgender workers who are already discriminated in urban spaces, whose livelihoods and lives are already insecure. Public toilets disappeared by the dozen, according to male sex workers. Toilets, they said in their words, can now be only used for urination and defecation, just like bus stands could be used only for waiting for buses. None of these places could be used for sex work anymore. And of course, everyone had a lot to talk about the metro as well. And the slow decay and eventual renovation of shopping complexes has also been a serious loss for these workers, because these shopping complexes have either been completely demolished and replaced with a mall, or have been renovated for upmarket sellers. A monumental loss for many female sex workers has been the steady decimation of single screen cinema theaters, which have been replaced either with malls or with shopping complexes or with multi-screen theaters. In fact, even till the 1990s in Majestic, you had Prabhat, Sagar, States, Kempegowda, Himalaya, Geeta, Nartaki, Majestic, Alankar, Kalpana, Menaka, Abhinay, Kapali, Tribhuvan. This was the entire string of theaters that was in the area, which these street-based sex workers were intricately woven with around the informal street economy with around these theaters. We too observed in our analysis that around 20 up to about 20 theaters in that area, either half of them had disappeared, turning into malls or so, and the other half were subjected to bold facelifts. So we attempted to ask a few of the auto drivers also about sex work in theaters, and they just shrugged and even denied it. So street-based sex workers spoke to us how ancillary after ancillary turned their backs on them and pulled the plank, how they were pushed place after place from a city that was theirs to roam and work freely. While until the early 2000s, sex workers had serious issues only with the police, who had terrific brutalities on them, now their new battles are the loss of space and the loss of social capital. There are new enemies and there are new threats. In fact, routine strategies by the police now include not only brutality and aggression on the street, and the police station, but also public humiliation, calling their names over loudspeakers, raids in private places, bare display of sex workers on television media. And when we asked these police officers about this, they said that the answers were the same. They all said, we need to clean up the city. We need to restore its decency at any cost. So the attitude to sex work is not just about social morality and crime. Even that is city image. Urban transition, I'll conclude in 2 minutes. Urban transition over the last 2 decades have planted practically landmines throughout their terrain. Their work, tapestries, no more a tapestry, it's more like a labyrinth that stonewalls them at every corner. Urban transition for street-based sex workers is not some sort of heartfelt regret or nostalgia, but the actual loss of an entire landscape in the city for sex work. An entire layer of informal labor and livelihood is scratched out through a variety of strategies. An entire alternative spatial and contour of the city is being expunged in the name of a fabric, in the name of a vista named Bangalore. Yes, street-based sex work still thrives in Bangalore with thousands of workers, but it's a pale shadow of what it was before urban transition, because they're blacklisted both as humans in the urban imaginary and as immoral elements in the workforce. However, they are very much a distinct urban cartography, and they have they're distinct. It is an integral commerce In urban space ecology, it has dedicated elements, artifacts, and spaces. Urban transition has reconfigured inequality very, very seriously. Yes, I conclude in a few seconds. They not only have to guard their bodily rights, as they always had to, but also now they have a right to reclaim their parts of the city. So the denial of the city to the sex workers begins with apprehensions about their very existence as informal workers and misbeliefs about the agency. I conclude by saying that sex work is undoubtedly work. Sex workers are legitimate workers who should be able to choose and provide for themselves through the occupation. Sexual commerce is a part of urban informal labor practices, and as Saskia Sassen says, an alternative circuit of survival in cities. If we recognize this, we should be able to redefine who the public is, and very importantly, what a city itself is. Thank you.
Thanks, Anand. Very, very fascinating study out there, and actually very interesting how it falls against what Srishti was saying in her presentation. I'm really looking forward to the conversation after all the presentations.
Yes.
I'll move on to Ankita Karmakar and Arunima Saha, who are at the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi. Over to you. Please keep a lookout on the chat box for the time alert.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Ankita Karmakar. I'm presenting the paper on the second sex and recreational culture, a socio-spatial urbanscape to redefine the urban peripheries of Kolkata with my co-author and colleague Arunima Saha. We both are urban designers from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. So, before starting the presentation, we would like to ask you to think about a scenario where Indian streets are full of women chatting, laughing, breastfeeding, discussing love, cricket, and movies. Is it ever possible to think that women are hanging out within their familiar neighborhoods, enjoying tea at local tea shops, or loitering fearlessly? Is it even imaginable, or is it just a utopian urban manifesto of strong feminist belief? So, a good city is one which integrates recreation as a system within everydayness, where whether men or women, regardless of differences, have the freedom to participate and enjoy. But in our cities, the social status of women has always been regarded as second sex, where the three layers are prevalent, like patriarchal dominations, complexities of other social relations, and socio-cultural normative beliefs. So recreation has always seen as an activity of leisure, an act of enjoyment, amusement, and pleasure for fun. And the city is continuously producing the conventional forms of recreational spaces as per their predetermined concept, which is always devoid of the understanding of how women interpret fun within their everyday lives. It has been seen that women don't have any residual fun time with presumed fun activities to perform within. They often realized it within the hardware of sociocultural norms which shape their behavioral ideologies majorly. It always performs through the everyday pattern of usage of physical setting. These are always the driving forces of creating a seam between her public and private domain, impacting the home ranges and finally impacting the neighborhoods to city level interdependencies. They have a different meaning of fun. For them, it's the basic right. So, which always demands a purpose, legitimacy for going out, an excuse to step out while getting social sanctity and safety. That's why they used to explore fun within the daily confrontation for availing daily needs within the everyday neighborhood pockets. Sometimes through kids and family rearing, involving into socio-cultural activities like attending kitty parties or pursuing religious activities, and sometimes learning and exploring economic opportunities, which are also playing a major role in this. All these are imparting the cultural landscape of the local identities, where physical setting is merely a plethora of behavioral pattern, the way of association along with safety and degree of engagement within the public spaces. Now coming to Kolkata. The city fabric of Kolkata has been always influenced by the socio-cultural norms since pre-colonial period, where behavioral pattern of women played a pivotal role. The neighborhood concepts in Kolkata have depicted through the interwoven fabric of Pada. It has not any physical boundary, but a mental boundary created through the socio-cultural norms, which is the primary territory of women's recreation. With the expansion of Kolkata, the peripheral areas are growing along major spine of Eastern Metropolitan Bypass. Like the first planned city Salt Lake in 1961, where because of sectoral growth, the home range for women's recreation is basically the home only and its surroundings. Then coming to Newtown, which started to grow from 1980. The infrastructural development and CBD concept made the home range for women limited to the individual flats itself. Then coming to the Vaishnav Ghata Patali Township, also known as BP Township, the first township developed under Kolkata Metropolitan Development Authority, where the block development concept has left the inner areas inactivated and major activities are happened only along the peripherous roads only, where majorly the young women are involved, but there is no place for engaging for other women like housewives, young professionals, or married professionals and elderly women itself. So from 2010 onwards, it has been seen with the introduction of extended Eastern Metropolitan Bypass, the major thrust of peripheral development has been located towards the surrounding southernmost fringe majorly. Because of that, Sonarpur Rajpur area has become the major focus now. So high speed and high rise development with outward everyday spaces along major corridors continuously affecting the cultural harmony of the existing traditional fabric there, which is gradually shifting the women's exposure physically and psychologically within individual gated communities only. This new large pockets of gated communities continuously increasing impermeabilities affecting the para culture of shared spaces. Now, from this, Arunima will present on Pada culture of Kolkata based on women-based usage with the difficulties being faced by the rising developmental problem along peripheries. And finally, we'll be ending with inclusive solutional approach to it. Thank you. Over to Arunima.
Thank you, Ankita. As Ankita has already mentioned, the city fabric of Kolkata has been influenced by the neighborhood concept of interwoven fabric of Pada, which is a primary territory of women's recreation. Pada is a smaller mental boundary, mostly defined by two peripheral roads. Generally, 3 to 4 paras collectively create a ward, and a minimum of 2 or 3 wards create a borough, which is a primary administration unit of Kolkata. The degree of association with the everyday public spaces within a para is primarily dependent on the legitimacy and familiarity. It is often found out that different kinds of women have used the para spaces differently, as there is no single woman, as the woman term itself consists of more varieties than the differences between men and women. As you can see the different maps here for college going student, housewife, young professionals, married professionals, and elderly, they are reflecting the different way of usage of the para, which is differs based on the age, occupation, and persona. So majorly it has been found out from worksite analysis that for housewives, married women, and elderly, their daily movement for availing various resources ranges within 50 to 150 meters. For younger age, it ranges within 300 to 500 meters, maximum up to 800 meters, depending upon comfortable walking range and walking speed. As you can see from the diagram, in a para and neighborhood structure, resources have been located as per their movement range. So the overall range varies from 50 to 800 meters within which the everyday resources have been placed. Coming to the para structure based on women usage, it has been found out that the para is basically consisted of 4 major lenses. These are longitudinally traversing with 1 or 2, across which various functional resources has been laid, where intensity of women usage is higher than the most. Women prefer the use of interwoven linkages, majorly rather than using the primary corridors, because of the familiar shortcuts within the NMV routes which lies within it. It has also found out that rather than the grid iron system, the amorphous interwoven system connecting the inward public spaces helps in slowing down the speed limits, confirming safety. In a para, the interpenetrable resources along a specific tertiary route create the permeability against gatedness, and the women are preferring different hierarchies of open spaces, like informal pockets, in between pockets, leftover spaces, courtyards, as for different persona rather than having a centered path. Now coming to the peripheral development, right now the major issue is lying within the plots because of what previously as a matter of fact of expansion of family within an accompanying expansion of land is now a single plot of land being subjected to constant fragmentation, which is also being reflected in the physical fabric of the fringe area. It also creates difficulties for government to intervene for laying out basic infrastructure facilities which creates chronic situations provoking more inward living conditions for women even within the domestic domain also. The other factors influencing are all lands privately owned, resulting into existence of multiple landowners, creating a single plot, and mid to high-rise dense clusters, creating impermeable privatized recreational spaces, again shared resources and decrease in informal public spaces. For urban governance and management, we can see the para area is under local municipal jurisdiction. In Kolkata, the local community representatives like club authorities, NGOs, self-help groups, Anganwadis, or local Mahila Samitis are playing a pivotal role in collaboration with municipality for local area development. All these groups are majorly having women representatives. But within these areas, the outreach under local municipality has almost diminished due to less exposure. The importance of women's participation in community-driven development has always been neglected. So their voices are either being dominated by male heads, or most of the times they are not willing to share their views, saying that अरे उन्होंने तो कह दिया है, आप वही लिख लो, मैं क्या कहूँ, which continuously impacting equal association and participation of women for their decision making from their surrounding neighborhood to the city level urban governance system. In the present times, the urban expansion is being focused along the major corridors, leaving negative edges along the water channels, water bodies, and impermeable pockets within the neighborhoods. But we can see from the previous studies that the recreational pattern has been seen within the internal pockets only, where it has been found out that the adda, which is a chit chat, spaces for housewives are majorly the club grounds, informal pockets near the schools and tuition centers, enclosed street edges, and spilled over local markets and courtyards. The teenagers prefer the peripheral backyard parks for its privacy. Tertiary alleys are animated at eye levels with projected planes, which are the magnet points of elderly women's adda. The animated balconies, terraces, courtyards of the projected planes outside the houses are the crossovers of socio-cultural art. The water bodies, informal pockets, animated nodes, backyard corridors are not only acting as a community punctures, but the associative icons for women, producing the community landscape for a para together, with shaping the socio-cultural identity of the city. So for considering women-friendly design framework for urban peripheries to increase the flexibility and retain cultural connection to maximize the women participation in the everyday neighborhood spaces, we should be considering within the three terms, which are the long-term, short-term strategies, and urban management. For area level long-term strategies, it is first to focus on the accessibility to the basic resources, which also prioritize the routes through the inter-women linkages with purposeful anchors. Physical safety, which provides inward public amenities rather than major corridor for providing slow speed movement. Psychological safety, which also refers to the human scale development, built from responded to passive surveillance and lighting. Shared resources, shared open spaces, shared multifunctional amenities, legitimate anchors, anchoring purpose-based amenities for maximizing participation of all genders. Also creating an urban seam, which includes cohesive public spaces irrespective of occupation, age group, and economic class. And lastly, the participation of women, women's participation in the CDP, learning and economic opportunity and capacity building. For area level short-term strategies, urban seam at the interface by providing interward and para-level resources, also concluding development guidelines, including open spaces, street edges, alleys, and incidental pockets. Open spaces including activation or anchoring of open spaces, water bodies, informal pockets near daily markets, schools, creches, of other or other kids-based amenities. Also understanding that these are also women-centric amenities. Tort laws, informal pockets should be internalized with proper passive surveillance. Street edges should be permeable built form with conforming visual porosity, and also should provide spillover spaces for informal activities. Alleys can be a more important point of these guidelines, which also provide activating alleys with temporal activities and also animating alleys at eye level projected plane treatment, responding to passive surveillance and also providing economic opportunities. Incidental pockets also providing inside out concept animated with quantitative attributes of temporality, sitting spaces with shading. The critical understanding of complexities of urban management responding to the physical spaces in relation to social cultural relations evolving across time and context is a key of co-creation of social spaces, fostering new urban identities for equal cities. Bottom-up approach creating association at different levels from neighborhood, community, borough to city is an important aspect towards the people-oriented design ideologies for co-creating and co-managing of urban spaces. It can also be done either through community level master planning for developing a newer area or retrofitting approach for an existing one. Community oriented design principles can also be channelized through the involvement of local governance, regardless of its informal and formal constitution. Therefore, the involvement of local club authorities, NGOs, self-help groups, Anganwadi, or local Mahila Samitis with public-private ventures are the inherent part of enforcing community level engagement where women play a pivotal role in decision making. The idea is to create a network of engagement where women play mentally, socially simulating spaces using actual perception and usage of pattern of creation, enhancing lifestyle, routines, aspirations of different intersection in relation to women, thus creating association of at different levels to ensure a sustainable development. We'd like to end our presentation with the final notes. As Ranade mentioned, when you design the city for women, you're designing for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankita and Arunima. That was a really interesting presentation. We have quite a vast range of presentations on urban spaces and its usage by women. Thank you again. Our next presenter is Malika Gupta from CEPT. Malika, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Malika Gupta and the main topic of my paper is I Don't Walk a Lonely Road, a study of women seeking leisure in a public park. Before I begin, I just want to thank the research team at IIHS for having me here. It's a really great opportunity for a young graduate like you. UNESCO defines cities as a characteristic combination of socio-political processes, cultural norms, and institutional arrangements which are open and accessible to all people, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, age, or socio-economic level. Unfortunately, cities in India are characterized more by their overbearing traffic, limited space, poverty, severe risk of violence, and lack of safety. While theorists have begun to discuss the impact of these issues on the global and local economy, mobility, and even climate, Indian urban scholarship has largely ignored how ideas about gender and women shape and are shaped by these urban issues. This intersectionality of urban scapes and women's issues gains importance when patriarchy, a systemic relationship of power between men and women, propagates itself through architectural arrangements of public space. When our cities are consciously planned to legitimize the domestication of women by associating the difficult public domain specifically with men, an innately gendered nature of public space emerges. When the design of public space itself fails to cater to women's unique needs for safety, sanitation, recreation, and leisure, the city itself privileges the life of some humans over that of others. In order to analyze women's place in the public domain, this study focuses on one of the most common forms of Indian public space, a public park. The study is conducted in one of Ahmedabad's major city-level parks, Parimal Garden, since it is an intentionally produced environment where architects have specifically designed spatial relationships in anticipation of certain uses of exercise and leisure. The objective of this paper was to explore associations between spatial cues and the experience of safety and leisure as a measure of resistance against restrictive social orders for women. Here, leisure has been identified as a critical and higher order goal that women in a public space aspire to seek, because by using public space without any defined purpose, women challenge the patriarchal belief that they belong indoors. The idea that leisure may be sought by women as individuals in the public and not just as members of families violates the social contract between men and women, public and private, and by extension between society and patriarchy. Implicit within this assertion of leisure is the guarantee of safety. Women are likely to feel comfortable and have pleasurable experiences in public spaces only if they feel safe. For the purpose of the study, in order to analyze the experience of safety, 3 parameters of assessment were identified: accessibility, high visibility, and maintenance and management. Since no singular definition for leisure is applicable to all women, 6 different subsites within the park with varying built and unbuilt features and multiplicity in intended activities were assessed for their capability to cater to women's leisure specifically. 3 key learnings emerged from the paper, each of which will be discussed in detail. The first learning from the study is that Parimal Garden as a public space is innately gendered in nature, despite the presence of women in it. Sorry. Yeah. This conclusion is drawn from various observations. The first is that mapping reveals that despite the high number of women in the park, at any given time, the number of men in the park is exponentially higher. The second observation indicates that the manner in which men engage with the park is significantly different to men, while men to women. While men were found crawling all over the site, engaging in various activities, women were found only at specific places associated with clearly defined functions, for example, the jogging trail or the open air gym. The last observation adds to the fact that women's distribution over the site is not just limited, but also influenced by the time of day and the presence of natural and artificial lighting. The second key learning from the study was that women's experience of safety is governed by spatial elements at different scales of intervention. Once it was established that the park is gendered in nature, the associations of these gendered patterns with the perceived experience of safety was analyzed. The first factor for assessment was accessibility. While all 4 entrances of the garden are located on major roads, analysis revealed that there was significant variation in their use by women. Women were found using entrances strategically designed to be in sight of a critical mass of people at all given times, which were well lit and had informative signage. Gates in the vicinity of conventionally male anchors, such as public toilets, were avoided, while gates in the vicinity of well-designed pavements, which accommodate vendors and the light and familiarity that they begin, were used actively. The second factor for assessment was visibility. While this has been discussed extensively in literature, this particular research revealed that, especially in the context of a lush public park, provision of safety occurs at different scales. The first is an organizational scale, where the layout of the park and the deliberate design decisions to place certain activities in adjacency to each other impact the degree of visibility. The second scale is architectural, where the decisions pertaining to form, material experience, degree of enclosure, visual permeability, etc., impact the degree of visibility. At both of these scales, the presence of natural vegetation in the form of tall trees, thick shrubbery, and large unlit water bodies impede or aid vision. Thus, design decisions taken at a landscape scale also gain relevance. These various scales can be understood in a case study of Site A, which clearly has very low use by women in the park. When assessed, one sees that it is at acute angles to the rest of the park, and the thick vegetation lining the path on all 4 sides conceals it from any nearby point. The path can only be seen from its entry points, and that too only during the day, as no light is provided at night, despite it being a stretch of over 50 meters. This was an organizational decision which impacts the accessibility and visibility. The architectural decision to give the adjacent brick pavilion a low lintel level, only slightly above average eye level, also limits the view of the path from the pavilion, further isolating it. Thus, a clear connection between spatial provision for visibility as a measure of safety and active use by women emerges. A second case study of the entire site reinforced women's dependency on visibility. Here, the usage pattern of women outside daylight hours are layered onto the lights available in the park. A strong interdependency is visible, so much so that women are seen abandoning the clearly defined jogging path and changing routes in response to the availability of light. This indicates that simply the provision of light is not adequate, since despite the high number of lights in the park, their short radius, uneven distancing, and unaccounted interruptions due to overgrown shrubbery leaves large pockets of the park in darkness. Since these areas are perceived as unsafe, they become inaccessible to women. Additionally, the impact of unmonitored growth of shrubbery indicates that the provision of safety is not a one-time solution, especially in the context of a dense landscape. In addition to the availability of amenities, the upkeep of these features is equally significant. In addition to the operational maintenance, which deals with repairs on a regular or casualty basis, maintenance must also be predictive in nature, such as snipping low-hanging trees or mowing the grass in a timely fashion. This brings us to the third and final learning of the study, which is that the practice of leisure is highly conditional in nature, but implicitly linked to the built environment. While 6 different types were studied, I will be discussing one particular case of the formal garden. The formal garden is an enclosed garden with tall columns and high parapet walls. Within the park itself, there are seats built into the parapet wall on 3 sides, and the fourth side descends into the water through wide steps. The various activities observed here indicate the conditional nature of leisure and its implicit links to the built environment. Due to the high enclosure of the garden, women were never observed alone there, even during the day. No light is provided within the garden, and tall, dense shrubbery blocks any ambient light that may come from outside. The same space is instead used actively by those women who, accompanied by their male partners, use the enclosure for engaging in romantic affection. Thus, young heterosexual couples are able to successfully optimize the same high parapet walls, low shrubbery, and lack of lighting that otherwise makes the space unsafe for single women. Another common use of this space is by middle-aged or older women sleeping in the concealed seats during afternoons. This is possible only due to the specific height and orientation of the parapet wall, as the parapet provides privacy from the rest of the garden, and the radial orientation of the seats allow the women to keep an eye on anyone who may enter the enclosure. Despite this, no woman was ever found sleeping alone, only in pairs or larger groups. In order to develop equitable, humane cities, both men and women must be able to safely access and have positive experiences in the public domain while feeling that they belong there. The paper concludes with the thought that this pleasure of belonging is enabled by the critical availability of sensitively designed facilities which cater to women's safety and respond to their unique requirements for sanitation, caregiving, recreation, and leisure. It is only when the unwomanly experiences, like that of leisure, are brought to the everyday cities and supported by public infrastructure, can we as urban designers begin to challenge the heavily gendered nature of our public spaces. Thank you.
Thanks, Malika. I think we have a really good collection to sort of work with when we reach the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to that. Our next presenter is Devdatta Parida from University of Alberta. Devdatta, over to you.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Very good morning to everyone. Seems like some very interesting presentations. And it's very to say that this particular session cannot be straight-jacketed into a particular theme, given the nature of scholarship, the scholars that have spoken before me. I would like to thank IIHS for inviting me to this particular panel. I was just a little curious as to which panel I'll go in when I got the mail that I'll be invited. So yeah, I'm Devdatta Parida. I'm an architect, urban planner. I'm a doctoral candidate at School of Urban Region Planning, University of Alberta in Canada. And as in this particular presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about smart city imaginaries in India and the inherent contradictions they have and how they are materializing in the urban space, because a lot has been talked about in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of actual ethnographic materialization of smart cities in India, studies seem to be, there's a dearth of studies. So I'm going to start off with a basic background of what's exactly happening. I mean, smart cities, at least in the urban space, urban planning discourse in India, smart cities have assumed a kind of a centrality, position of centrality, at least in the last 4 or 5 years, mostly triggered by regime change. In scholarly literature, you would find that there are several critiques of the smart city imaginary itself, and one of the very interesting, I think, seminal paper would be Iona Datta's paper, where she talks about smart cities, a huge critique of the smart city. She takes the example of Dholera city in Gujarat, where she, kind of contends that smart cities are mostly, entrepreneurial imaginations of the state, which is having authoritative tendencies, mostly drawn by neoliberalism. There's another interesting paper by Chakravarti where he mentions that smart cities are basically, self-justificatory narratives of the state, so there are various critiques of the smart city that already exist, and I'm not going to really try to add more on that one. But one of the things that I noticed while I was going through a lot of literature on smart city is that a lot of scholarly literature has engaged with the phenomena either completely rhetorically, or either having comparative studies between a large sample, like the 100 smart cities mission in India, or like taking say 10 metro cities, or different kinds of studies. And one of the things that one of the gaps that I noticed is on the top of your screen in Ayana Datta's paper, where she mentions that we do not have enough ethnographic details of the everyday struggles faced by mostly the marginalized population who are already at the margins of urban space. And that kind of, if you're a smart city scholar in India, that should really ring a bell in your head, thinking that, oh, how is that possible that we do not have enough local ethnographic studies. And that's what is the motivation behind doing this study. And so I will not, in the interest of time, go into a lot of theoretical angles that I'm using, but one thing that I felt important to speak about is that is the work of Van Asch, Christoph Van Asch, where they mention that a lot of planning happens, especially in contemporary era, happens because of a complex interplay between actors, institutions, discourses. And these actors, institutions, discourses do not simply shape each other, or like get shaped by each other, but they also co-evolve in relation to each other. So strategies are not fixed, strategies keep evolving. And so there is always, because a city, because urban space is always in a state of flux, and strategies by different actors, different they keep changing, and discourses change, narratives will change, and hence the other actors will have to change themselves accordingly. And that's a theoretical frame that kind of I used while being in the field. The question I'm asking here is, how do smart city imaginaries impact the collective and political life of informal residents in cities? And of course, there could be many forms of informal residents. There could be homeless people, there are smart, the slum dwellers, and there could be any marginalized population. But in this case, I'm mostly focusing on slum dwellers. So I'm looking at Bhubaneswar city. As you may or may not be knowing, the Bhubaneswar city was on top of the 100 smart cities list in the 2015 or 16 list of smart cities put out by the central government. Some details of the city of around 1 million population, but interestingly, around 20% of the population lives in slums, around 430 of them. I am particularly looking at the case of a particular slum redevelopment project. So the images that you see is of a town center district. This is part of the area-based development of the Smart Cities program in Bhubaneswar. So this is supposed to be a smart neighborhood, where there are multiple projects happening simultaneously. So there's this road beautification, cycling infrastructure, equity, knowledge centers, some eco, wetland conservation, etc., etc. And one of the things involves slum redevelopment work, wherein there will be a displacement of around 26 slums nearby from other places in Bhubaneswar, where they will be brought here. Around 2,000 households would be supposedly rehabilitated. In this particular case, so this area, this project is known as Shanti Awas, which is like so there's a slum nearby currently existing. So I just changed the direction here. So this is the project that I'm talking about. This is around 20 acres of land. So there's a slum that exists right here. And then there's a project that has started now in which, there are like 4-storied, 5-storied apartments where the slum dwellers are supposed to be, put in as part of this smart neighborhood that is coming up in Bhubaneswar. So what that has put is that currently the Shantipalli slum that is existing right here, around 200 households are right now at immediate risk of eviction, and this has been going on from some years now, I think. But then this particular case has come up in public in the last 1.5 years, where around 200 households now are kind of protesting, and there's a lot of tussle between the state and these slums. And so this image speaks a lot. On the left, you see the infrastructure that is coming up, as part of a PPP program by the state government. On the right, you see the Shantipalli slum, and as you see, there is hardly a 200 or 300 feet gap between them right now. This project is right now on halt because the slum dwellers have gone to the court, successfully managing to stay this particular redevelopment project. But this this uh, this image is powerful because this is where capitalism and neoliberal interest is right on your face. And I wanted to kind of explore what happens when projects like this are right hit on you. And I wanted to see how slum dwellers are reacting to this and what stories they have to tell about what's actually happening in their lives. Oops. So quickly, just been having multiple interviews, repeat interviews with a lot of slum leaders. Some of these leaders have, evolved in the last 2 years alone from the time they had the risk of being evicted. And so I'm looking at specifically the Odisha Basti Sangharsh Samiti, which is like a collaboration of a lot of slum activists and RTI activists in the city, where they have come together and now they are trying to take the fight not just on the streets but to different multiple sites. And I also talked to some planners and bureaucrats part of this, and looked at some relevant documents related to the smart city proposal, area-based development, the redevelopment project proposals, and some media reports. So my observations, I'll just tell you three observations and probably give you some snippets of information that came up from the interviews. So first thing I noticed was how a lot of, when I talked to a lot of planners and bureaucrats, how this, and the term that I could come up with was middle class complacency. And that has, that creates a kind of a demand for smart neighborhoods. And those demands for smart neighborhoods then, uh, result in certain kind of, imagination of projects. And, then which in their materialization, or at least in their, intended materialization, marginalized slum dwellers and, privilege the middle class basically. When you're talking of smart cities, a lot of you see the news about Bhubaneswar in smart cities, and a lot of positives that come out. There's this beautiful, like street beautification project, or it's a smart governance and etc. But the implicit assumption of the state is very interesting to see, is that the smart neighborhoods are somehow superior, although all the scholarly evidence doesn't really talk about any form of advantage that smart neighborhoods really provide to the urban space. Rather, there's a lot of criticism of it. But so there's a little contradiction between what scholars think about it and how the people in the field are talking about smart cities and how superior they are. The second thing that I wanted to discuss is smart neighborhoods in their materialization are causing direct displacement and are creating a culture of conflict. Because when you have so for taking the example of Shantipalli, Basti, where there are like around 200 households out of 1,200 households only that are getting affected immediately. So that means that they're going to lose political linkages. They're going to have a different lifestyle, that's going to affect their livelihood. When I say livelihood, I'm not talking of just economic angles of livelihood, but social linkages and political patronages also get broken along with it, and that can affect your everyday existence in the city. And the other thing I noticed is that I draw it from Vanessa Watson's ideas of deep differences and conflicting rationalities, where she talks that what if there are two groups of people within a city who simply have differences so bad that there can be no communication, there can be no dialogue. And one of the things I also noticed during my fieldwork is that there is conflicting rationalities, not just between groups, between the state and the slum dwellers, but also within groups, within the slum dwellers. There are also different multi-slum groups that are also, kind of weakening some of their, interest in the city. The third point I wanted to discuss is a rather positive part, if you're a scholar of resistance. And I when I was looking at a lot of there's this sudden beginning of a lot of insurgent practices that are shaping up, but they are also organized insurgent practices and not like the old demonstrations simply against on the day of activism, on the day of evictions that you see in a lot of Indian cities. But now those sites of conflicts have also changed. They have gone to the courthouses. They have also gone through RTI and other forms. So these counter hegemonic strategies are now formal as well as informal. But one thing that I remember is this idea that smart and now slum dwellers have resorted to plain refusal of the smart city initiative. Earlier there was room for negotiation, but this has evolved into a complete plain refusal. They just want to stay where they are. They're asserting their right to the city, and so their desire is to achieve, get formal first. They don't care about these smart neighborhoods that are coming up in their immediate just around them. And so their imaginary of the city, their imaginary, their desires, and is based on mostly need and desire to be close to the political circles. I just show you some snippets that I found from the interviews. And so the first point I was making about middle class complacency, this is something a planner was very candid when he spoke to me, that informality is one of our big problems. We just allow those people to stay there thinking where will they go? They're poor people, but we have to also be very strict because law is same for everyone. And, they're sitting there illegally. And this is a classic argument that planners make, right? And then he ended up saying that, okay, you see some of these slums, he mentioned some of the slums which are on prime locations in the city, prime for real estate market, of course. But he says that they're absolutely not tenable. So there's this basic, kind of internalization that, market forces will eventually dominate the day. And so why should we regularize these slums? Because they're not tenable anyway. Real estate market should and will eventually come up and take their positions. And so there are also other things, like there's this slum in Saliasai, which is again in one of the prime locations, which also had similar issues where they wanted to convert that into a shopping mall. And there was a huge uproar, and right now that has also stopped in the city. The second point I was making was made by a activist, where he talks about that the government always keeps saying that, okay, there's hardly any land, it's the capital city, and there's hardly any land to give to any of the slum dwellers. But they have given 50 acres of land to DLF. They have given around 150 acres land to a very big university there in the city, and private institutes have also got around 1,000 private institutes have come up in the last 20 years alone. And so they're selling land and making money, but at the same time, when it comes to giving land to the slum dwellers as per their needs, the government doesn't want to give land. So there's this issue of what the government wants to give the slum dwellers and what the slum dwellers want. I'll talk to that. I'll talk about that later in the third point that I'm making. And this idea that smart city projects are resulting in displacement and conflict, just reveals the nature of urban politics, and how state speak is now entering into local issues. And so one of the things that one of the activists was saying, reflecting, is that slum dwellers are often forced to support the ruling party, else they are targeted by eviction. So now the state has become, like a big boss or a big brother, where now it's picking up its fight, where it wants to target, and then of course election cycles also contribute some of that. But now the post-elections things have also, kind of got worsened a bit. But at the heart of their insecurities, the slum dwellers think that it's the lack of tenured land that is really causing all this conflict that is happening. And one of the slum residents, who also later became an activist in the last couple of years, she reflected the government has created transit houses which are like vending zones. So basically they give them some polythene sheets and tell them to stay in for like months till these apartments that are being constructed, that I showed you in one of the images, will come up, so that they will one day be able to go there. They come directly on the evening before the day of eviction and then give us notice to shift there. Again, a classic strategy by the state. Then next day they come with their bulldozers to evict us. We have stayed here for over 4 decades. How can they simply throw us out? So actually in 2010, the Odisha High Court gave a notice that, if any slum has existed for more than 10 years, yeah.
I'm sorry, your time is up. So could you just...
Oops, I didn't. Yeah, I'll just skip all this, and I'll just tell one interesting point that, I draw it from Michel Foucault's idea of counter conducts. And so I wanted to say that counter-conducts are basic refusal to listen to the state. And, so what I am observing here is that, there's this imagination of the state that, it is superior and it has a desire to dominate the urban space through inclusion of the slum dwellers. And on the other side, you see slum dwellers resorting to counter-conducts. And and the fact that we are able to delay the smart city project is also that creates a romanticized, I would say there's a romance in that resistance. The fact that there is a delay and they have not completely failed, but they have resorted to being very strategic about it is a positive sign for, evolution of planning thought and planning practice in India, that there is room for, democratic rights. So I'll stop there and then I can take questions later. Thank you.
Thanks. Please do send in your questions on the Q&A box or the chat box. I'll get started in the meanwhile. My first question is actually to Anant and Shrishti. And perhaps even Arunima and Ankita can, answer the same question. I was actually really curious through some of these presentations about, in some sense, a contradictory imagination of what the city is, where, while Shrishti is talking about the cosmopolitanism and how it is being seen in relation to women's, access to public spaces. I'm really curious, Anant, through your work, it appears to suggest that this kind of cosmopolitanism in some sense is detrimental to women accessing the same spaces for, doing sex work. If you could both speak a little bit to this, changes in our city and what the cleanup means for one group of women, but could mean something completely different to another group of women. Shrishti, do you want to go first?
Yeah, can Anand go first? After that, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, sure. Anand, do you want to go first?
Well, sex workers all over the world have had a rather strange but very serious problem. And that is sometimes their biggest adversaries towards recognizing their agency have been feminists themselves. Not all feminists. There have been categories of feminists whom they have been trying to avoid as much as possible, because many of them pose as their saviors, which the sex workers don't want to, they don't want to look like some sort of passive patients of some sort of saving. But why I'm saying this in the context of urban space and the presence of the public woman is that on the one hand, of course, there are very serious limitations as to even women from upper strata of society to appear public in certain places, in certain urban spaces. But very often it is women themselves who, several categories of women themselves who have pointed fingers in an accusatory manner towards sex workers for being there, that is being present at a public space. So this is, it's not to pit woman against woman or something like that. It's not about that, but about the fact that, the sex worker, especially the female sex worker and the transgender sex worker, are that much more disavowed in public space by more privileged women themselves. So, and the other issue that we saw is when speaking to these workers was that, in several cases, it's because many decent women, I have to put my double quotes here, many decent women felt that the presence of the sex worker were contaminating their right to be present. You see, so it's a very complicated deal when we speak about the public woman, the presence of the female in urban space as far as sex workers go. They face an intersectionality of problems.
Yeah, that's interesting, because throughout the presentations, I kept thinking about, how urban planning, the idea of what the city is, even words like smart city, how they are being used to, conjure up spaces and change them over a period of time. And what it means for various kinds of people accessing this, especially women and, perhaps even transgender folks, as you talked about it. But that contradiction is so visible in the way we imagine the urban space, right? If you wanted to comment, Shrishti?
Yeah. So I just wanted to add to Anand's comments is that it is not only about women, it is not only about the privileged women or the sex workers, but it's also about um, how we socially construct work, like the like hierarchizing different forms of work. Like, why is it that sex workers are treated in a particular way and so-called other women are not treated in that way? So I don't think like it is definitely about women's presence in the public sphere, but it's also about how their work is also constructed as being decent, like quote unquote decent and non-decent. So yeah, like that kind of hierarchization of different forms of work is also something which women have to negotiate in the public space every day.
In fact, I would absolutely agree with Srishti. I did forget that point, which we have elaborated not only in this study. Of course, due to interest of time, we couldn't talk about that. But I did mention in the presentation that, as you correctly said, first of all, as not good enough, as not decent enough women, female sex workers are not allowed on the streets. And secondly, even in the hierarchy of informal labor, street vendors are okay. Mobile street vendors are okay. People selling things on cycles are okay, but sex work is not even an informal work. So even in the hierarchy of work, they are blacklisted. So I think I did mention that in the presentation, that they're double blacklisted as people and as workers, both. So thank you for reminding me to mention that.
No, that's really interesting point that you raised there, because I was also thinking, when both Arunima and Ankita and Malika are talking about parks, for example, about how better lighting, better access, what groups of women access these spaces, how do they negotiate the city. I can't help but see just the language that is used differently, for in some sense is contradictory, maybe not in our heads theoretically, but in the state's eyes. And so things like the cleaning up, for instance, or better lighting, or more CCTV cameras for protection, all of these have certain implications for women accessing these space. And I was curious if Malika or Arunima and Ankita, you wanted to come in here and speak a little bit about what it means to sort of, because Malika, in your very clear diagrams and maps, you've shown us how, what are the spaces that women actually access. So if you can, tell us a little bit more about what does it mean for women's access to public spaces? And then Anant, maybe I'll come back to you again, because it really stands out, in the eyes of the state as a very contradictory image. Maybe we look at it a little differently through the lens of labor and employment and the body, but in the eyes of the state, what does this mean?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, because it's very interesting that to sort of differentiate between safety and visibility and this whole idea of surveillance. And unfortunately, like if you look at what the theory has talked about, it's always been that every time someone wants to make something safer for women, it involves the women being trapped or the women being protected, and that propagates the whole image that public space is not safe for them and they must be looked after. And this is something that has not just reflected in terms of society, but also in our laws. It is what and state. So that's exactly that's why I don't discuss CCTV cameras, because that seems the simplest solution, that you put cameras and then it's safe. The idea that's exactly when the whole act of leisure is so different. So leisure for you or me or someone else from different backgrounds is so different. And for someone, it may be a walk, for some may be being with their partner, and that requires different degrees of privacy, different degrees of surveillance. So it's important to understand how making different spaces which cater to different needs and is a very different phenomena, rather than just making sure that everybody can see everything, because that is detrimental, especially in our society, which is so restrictive. And that this is only when we're talking about women. If you go into the whole LGBTQ sector and things like that, it gets much, much worse.
Ankita?
Yeah, I also wanted to add, with Malika has already been said, that it's not about CCTV camera or kind of passive surveillance which is being put right now in public spaces for it's just used as a tool for giving them a protection, so that the women can access to the public spaces. But it's not about this kind of thing. It's about social construct. It's about their psychological thing that and not only psychological thing, it's just a fact of getting social sanctity. Otherwise, it is, whenever we are doing the surveying, it has been said that हम लोग तो वहां पे जा नहीं सकते क्योंकि हमें मतलब सोसाइटी से ही कहेंगे कि यू आर लूज कैरेक्टर थिंग, काइंड ऑफ थिंग. So, and also another thing I want to like more precise, that putting so much of social surveillance kind of thing is also restricting women for getting access to the public spaces, rather than is if the build form or if the social fabric is made in such a way so that eyes on the street or passive surveillance is very much natural thing, then it will be very much beneficial for women as well as other people to uh, to be within the everyday spaces of public activities, because public spaces is not like the city level destinations but also within the everyday neighborhood we are confronting for our daily need itself.
Shrishti or Anant, would you want to respond to any of that? I'm just looking at some of these papers together and then I'll move to Shreya and Devdatta.
Yeah, I would like to add one point. Like a few months back, we were going through I was going through a documentary Q2P. So it's basically in Mumbai, where we can see how even the architecture, the state architecture, is also something which is very much gendered. Because we see the number of, like, it is not only about leisure, but how something as public like something as basic as public toilets, they are more for men and women have nowhere to go. So women's visibility is even negotiated even for something as basic as excretion. So yeah, like it's like there is so it's not only about leisure, it's about everything that women have to negotiate in the everyday like in the everyday in these public spaces that are of concern.
Anant, anything else that you want to respond to before I move on to the other person?
Nothing to add right away. It's been quite well covered.
Okay. So, Devdatta, there's a question for you from Manas. You mentioned that these smart city imaginaries may be fostered by middle class complacency. Why not middle class complicity? Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, if I can reflect on what I saw on the field, so obviously you cannot deny the fact that there is some amount of complicity of the middle class, but I was saying that, you know, there is also a continuous evolution of middle class discourses that are happening. If you look back some 20 years ago or even 30 years ago, when there was slum, it's not like slum evictions never happened, right? When slum evictions used to happen in the 90s and early 2000s, it was explicitly where the middle class was complicit in the everyday language that we used. I mean, a lot of people used against slum dwellers. And that has evolved into now, if you talk to a general middle class, I mean, unless they are probably talking very radical or something like that, but if they'll all tell you that, oh, we should have participation, we should have inclusive planning, and, you know, all those language. And yeah, a lot of planners and bureaucrats pick up on that. And now that has, you know, so now if you see middle class discourses are no more, I mean, complicit very explicitly. So the complicity is there implicitly, but what is more explicit is that complacency that they're having, that, okay, nothing can happen to them while they are actively engaged in, you know, illegal construction, for example, you know, but they know that when there is a smart neighborhood in town, the urban slums will be the ones that will get affected the most, that will get, you know, displaced. And so that's the nature of complacency that I'm talking about on the part of the middle class. Not that, you know, they are not complicit, but yeah, they're there as an undercurrent. But what is more explicitly coming out is that that there's a, you know, the state wants to dominate, continue its domination, but now it wants to appropriate the ideas of inclusion. You know, so the state wants to claim that we want to be, you know, inclusive, while the, you know, the nature of slum evictions just continue. So that's the complacency that I was referring to explicitly.
Okay, thanks.
I hope that answers to some extent.
Okay. I wanted to also ask Shreya a little bit, in your abstract, you also talk about thinking of a community which is both the subject and object in social science research. Can you expand a little bit more about it, both in terms of what does it mean in terms of methodological frameworks and also theorizing or conceptualizing this duality when you're studying a particular community?
Yes, what I wanted to do in terms of the subject and object of research is to look at how through different points we can study a community. So be it in terms of the Bengali or the Marwari community, both these communities, as we place them as a subject, as a researcher, when I am trying to look at them in the field, and also how they negotiate in their everyday life, how these two communities are negotiating and interacting in the field. So there is a way in which it was observed that both the communities are considering themselves as a doer, as the person who is acting in the field, and also as a person who is on the receiving end of some kind of development, be it the, especially when we, if I can give the example of the Bengali home owners, when they are trying to sell their house, that time they are acting. There is an active participation, or there is an active role that they are taking up. But when they are, in several cases, there has been owners who would be approached by brokers, or who would be approached by dalals, and most of them would be Marwaris, who would send their touts to reach out to these families to ask them if they are planning to sell off their house. So there was this point where I mentioned that there was a domino effect in the neighborhood whenever there would be one house that would be sold. So that is where I think this kind of subject-object kind of negotiation between the community comes out the most. I hope I have been able to point out.
Thanks for that. We also had a longish comment on the chat box. Perhaps the presenters can look at it themselves, and I'll also read it out. For several presenters, in considering the gendered use of urban spaces, we, that is architects, planners, urban designers, typically assume an ontological divide between social reproduction and spatial reproduction, thereby restricting agency. Women behave this way or that way in certain types of spaces or other. I wonder we could learn from Judith Butler's performativity, my body is and is not mine, such that both spaces and social relations may be constituted through performativity. If anybody would want to respond to that quickly. In the meanwhile, if there are any other questions, please do send us on the Q&A box. I also wanted to sort of, just throw in a reflection about this idea of, the gendered nature of our cities, which comes up through Anand's papers, through sort of, it being looked down as not being an occupation, or something that women would do for employment, whereas in other papers being talked about in terms of pure the experience of negotiating a city, what it means to navigate different spaces, whether it's within your own neighborhood or somewhere outside. But I also wanted to sort of juxtapose it with what Devdatta was trying to say through the whole ideology of the smart cities. He doesn't specifically talk about gender or any particular group in that sense, but it's an interesting sort of play, because we know that the smart city is also being used to bring up certain ways in which we imagine our city. What would our city look like through this sort of conceptualization, the language that is being used, the money that is being used, and for what purpose. So I wanted to sort of look at that, and if any of you through your fieldwork or the research that you've been doing have sort of looked at what it means for our cities as they move ahead, in terms of women's bodies negotiating different spaces in the city.
Can I start? I've just been trying to understand the question in the chat box as well. But I think it's what a lot of our studies are trying to emphasize on is not the fact that social relationships and spatial relationships are separate, and that we must also start considering this particular social relationship. I think the essence which even movements like the whole smart city movement should adopt is sort of very simple. Like, when we do these theses, you realize that the steps are so simple. Sometimes you feel that is it really that, if it was that easy to design spaces that accommodated women, why isn't everybody doing it? It's like, rainwater harvesting. It's so easy, but nobody does it. So I think the idea is, the first thing is the acknowledgement that the way different people who are not cis hetero men use public spaces very differently, and just the acknowledgement that design, because every time, especially I just graduated in architecture, you're told you have to be neutral. So I think the first step is that acknowledgement that being neutral is no longer enough, and that once that idea that you have to be inclusive gets adopted at different scales, then you are able to provide more contextual, more inclusive design strategies.
Thanks for that. Anybody else who would want to respond?
I can add some things. Of course, I will not engage a lot with the issue of gender. I don't think I'm the best person to, because I haven't engaged with a lot of literature on that, with some minor pieces here and there. But yeah, I'm going to talk of a more sweeping, issue of general idea of any marginalized communities, and that includes women, as we know that, women or transgenders, and I was looking at slum dwellers, for example. But so one thing I noticed that when you look at the smart city discourse, it also appears to be inclusive of gender identities, and at least claims to be, but as you start looking at the local narratives of the people, uh, my general observation would be that that's not quite the case. That's why I said I use the term contradictory. There are a lot of contradictions in what the smart city claims. Now, one thing I did notice, at least in the context of Bhubaneswar city, was that when I was talking about insurgents, that's coming up, counter hegemonic practices, women have started to take up a lot of, they've asserted a lot of position in the policy space in recent couple of years, because a lot of this slum activism has come up where I went there not expecting to meet a lot of women, but they were the most, the most likely to come forward and talk to me. So I think out of my interviewees, almost half of them were actually women who were more, inclined to speak about a lot of, uh, lot of issues. So I think, the other point that I think one of the in the questions in the chat, I think the question was on the spatial and social and how we can separate or not separate the two. But I immediately was thinking of the idea of third spaces by Edward Sojas, where he talks that there is also a relative permanence and impermanence that can exist together. And so there is, I think, a constant struggle. There are spaces, our urban spaces are very good examples of, a lot of our urban spaces are example of third spaces where, there is a social and a spatial that are always there, and there is always partly missing, the social or the spatial is always missing. And that is where imaginations are playing out, and there's an interplay. So, so yeah, not a lot on gender, but yeah, this is just based on what I saw on the field.
Thank you.
Saw a comment, I am very sorry about that.
Ankita, would you, Ankita?
Yes. I want to add with Mallika's comment, like she is also telling that we are acknowledging the basic need of a woman. We are not forcing an urban space that this needs to be gendered, and this are the particular spaces which are women friendly spaces, and we are putting women within these spaces only, and they are abide by to go there. It's just the acknowledgement of their basic need. We don't need to consider, I mean, how the pattern, how they're using the spaces. Maybe it's not the city level public spaces, maybe it's not the everyday neighborhood spaces, it's just their home itself, how they are enjoying their home with uh, intersection of other age group, like chatting with their mother-in-law or engaging with their kids playing in front of the garden or using the plinth area itself, projected things which we used to see. But right now we are so much of looking into the macro aspect or the minute, or maybe going to the minute level things of giving kind of design guidelines. We are somehow overlooking the basic things, the basic parameter they are using it, so that men and women both can participate equally in the public, I mean, not the so-called public spaces, but a space which has the seam between public and private, which is somehow missing right now.
Thanks for that. Yeah, please go ahead.
I just quickly add to this. I think that's why it's so important to just to add what she said. Ankita said that it's so important to study things like sanitation and leisure, because every time the issue of women comes up, everybody simply talks about safety, and that's what results in these CCTV problems. Because safety is so limiting that it's so basic. You don't realize that safety, the fact that you can go into the road is not enough. You must be able to, you have to have that right, you have to have that belongingness. So that's why this more wholesome picture of looking at urban spaces is required.
I really, I just really wanted to add with it, because whenever I have started with my thesis with this women and recreation, it was just put in the question, what are you doing? I mean, it's all about women's safety. And I was like, it's not about safety. Safety is like always giving to the extremities of rape or teasing, but it's not about that thing. It's also,
No, thanks so much for bringing that up, because the whole idea of leisure, as Malika was saying, or the idea of just sort of experiencing your neighborhood freely. And when I use the word free, I don't mean it in the sense of safety, but just the ability to accept, enjoy your neighborhood. That conversation is sort of subsided, because we start talking about larger things, which are very embedded in goals like smart cities and so on. Anant, you wanted to come in?
In fact, as this particular workforce goes, that is street-based sex workers and as far as smart cities goes, one of the things that we have seen is that when visualizing a city, it need not be in terms of the formal smart cities project. There are those people who you don't want over there when you think of a city, and there are those people who you don't even acknowledge are there in the first place. So there are two problems over here, which many of these different categories of street-based sex workers look at. But I think what's important to add over here, especially as far as smart cities go, is that they completely, more than particular categories of people, they completely rule out any sort of organic development of human ecology in a city. And why I say this is because if you take, for example, theaters, what I had just mentioned, that there is a completely organically developed informal economy around cinema theaters, around public toilets, which is completely either ignored or denied or totally disavowed as far as smart cities go. It's a far more manicured and far more gentrified deal. In fact, at this point of time, I should probably say that we have covered quite a bit of this in our research, and hopefully towards the end of the year, we should have an entire book manuscript on urban transition and street-based sex work coming up for those who might be more interested to look at city and these categories of workers. Also, we already have a paper out. That is, my co-author Neeti has brought out a paper, her paper in the journal City, which came out a few months ago. Something that one might want to see on this particular topic. Okay? I just thought I'd just mention that in case anybody would like further reading on this.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think we've also reached the end of our time. Thank you to all the panelists for a very exciting, seminar. All of you, excellent papers, and we look forward to reading more. Thanks for engaging with the questions, and thanks again. The next session is at 1 p.m. So please do join us for that session. Thank you.